My name's Garina Sasi. I'm on the Gaithersburg Book Festival committee. I'm also the chair of workshops, and I'm an author myself, so I know how hard it is to get a book done. Susan and Shuana will be signing their books after this panel, and it will be inside the Boer Art Center. So, and it's air conditioned in there and very nice. So you should go and get your book signed. And also a plug for buying books. This is a free event, but it does help our festival if you buy a lot of books. And the more books we sell at our events, the more publishers want to send their big name authors to our events. So purchasing books from Politics and Prose, which is our partner, also inside the Boer Art Center, benefits our local book festival, our local economy, and celebrates our books and writers. So if you enjoy the program and you're in a position to, please go and buy books here. Now, let me talk about these three lovely ladies. Susan Coll is a fixture in the Washington, D.C. area literary community. Her books include The Stager, a New York Times and Chicago Tribune editor's choice, and Acceptance, which was made into a television movie starring the hilarious Joan Cusack. Bookish People is her latest publication. It's her 6th novel. In addition to her novels, her work has appeared in publications including the New York Times Book Review, the Washington Post, the Washingtonian Magazine, Moment Magazine, NPR.org, Atlantic.com. I could go on, but I'm going to stop there. She's currently the president of Penn Faulkner Foundation, and she's part of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore. So welcome to Susan.
Yay!
Our other author is Shuana Robinson. She's the author of 2 novels. Her novel, The Banned Bookstore of Maggie Banks, made the list of best books and best picks in Country Living, Indie Next, Library Reads, Shondaland, and Good Housekeeping, and BuzzFeed, and Pop Sugar. And again, I could go on, but I'm going to stop there. She's originally from San Diego. Now she lives somewhere in Virginia.
Very mysterious.
And her bio online points out that she's an introvert at heart, and she spends most of her time reading, baking, and figuring out the politest way to avoid social interactions.
Couldn't get out of this one.
Yeah, she couldn't get out of this one, so please be nice to her if you see her afterward. Their discussion is going to be moderated by Hannah Oliver Depp. Hannah is the owner of Loyalty Bookstores in Petworth, D.C., and in Silver Spring, Maryland, and she's the founding member of the American Booksellers Association's Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. She serves on the boards of the Bookshop.org, an open book foundation, and the Atlantic Independent Booksellers Association. And she knows a thing or two about bookstores, so she seems like the perfect person to be getting us into this discussion, and I will now hand it over to Hannah.
Thank you so much. Major thanks to Gaithersburg Book Festival for having me and for all of you for coming out here. I was like, oh, it's like only 60 degrees, and now I'm like, I haven't been outside in warm weather in a long time. So I hope everyone's allergy medicine is working, and also for all of us that all of our deodorant is also working. I am truly delighted to be here on this panel. I love talking about weird book people. I love talking about bookstores and how it is both the best and the worst job ever imaginable. Full confession, Susan and I used to work together. She's one of my favorite people in the whole wide world. Shuana, I have been stalking you online, so this is like we're just gonna play it cool. It's fine. But I just truly love both of these books and their work in general, so this is going to be a good time, y'all. But before we jump in, I wondered if you all would take just give us your book elevator pitch so everyone knows what the heck I'm talking about when I ask you these questions. Shuana, would you take it away?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us here. So The Banned Bookshop of Maggie Banks is about a young woman named Maggie who is feeling a little aimless in life. She's been laid off. She's living with her parents. She's almost 30, and she just has no idea what she's doing. And so when her best friend goes on maternity leave and asks Maggie if she wants to take over the bookstore for a few months, Maggie says sure. And she doesn't realize when she gets to her best friend's small town in Maryland fictional small town called Bell River, that the entire town is obsessed with this author named Edward Bell, also fictional, who wrote a really great American novel, like set decades ago, and now tourists all come to see the place where he wrote his novel, and the bookstore isn't allowed to sell anything that was published after his lifetime because they want to stay stuck in the past and bring all the literary tourists in. And so Maggie decides to start secretly selling some more modern books on the side and holding events, all while trying to keep this all secret from Edward Bell's descendant, who is very closely watching the bookstore. So a lot of small town shenanigans ensue.
Mm-hmm. Yes, shenanigans indeed. Susan?
Yeah, I can already see the overlapping themes, which is not surprising because they're bookstore books. But my book is set during 1 week in August 2017 in a unnamed DC bookstore. It's the week of events in Charlottesville, so that kind of gives it a backdrop of seriousness at the same time that it's a kind of a madcap comedy. The owner of the bookstore is going through her own kind of crisis. She's recently widowed. She's very shaken up by Charlottesville. She's thinking that this might be a good time to sell the bookstore. At the same time that she's also thinking it might be a good time to barricade herself inside the bookstore and never leave. So she has some issues to sort through. And then I've also got the point of view of a beleaguered events coordinator. And also in the kind of overlapping theme area, I've got a poet who's scheduled to speak at the store, but he's effectively been canceled. This is before we even had the words cancel culture, but people are protesting him. They don't want him to be out there in the world selling his book. So Sophie, the owner, has to reckon with all of this over the course of 1 week, and then at the center of it all is a perpetually broken vacuum cleaner that we'll probably talk more about.
Yeah. Both of your books really do have a reality aspect to them while being very funny. But the details that are in the book just really show me that there's been some customer service in your life, for sure. But I do want to get into our fabulous protagonists. Sophie, who owns a unnamed bookstore in DC, and she's so burnt out, but like not in the way maybe we see where somebody's just tired or whatever. She's really having this kind of like existential crisis, and she doesn't know whether to lean further into quite literally staying inside the bookstore forever or to extricate herself. And then Maggie, the titular character of the banned bookshop of Maggie Banks, is running the store on behalf of her friend, but she's totally lost. And she has like this dictatorial society basically who's like trying to run every aspect of this thing that's supposed to be giving her this vigor. These characters have to let go and get through a lot of preconceived notions that they have about themselves, that the people who love their bookstores have about themselves, right? And they've kind of, their identities are tied to their bookstores. So why is a bookshop the perfect setting for reinvention and discovery? And did you start out with the bookstore or the character to get through something? Yeah.
Okay. Well, so first of all, I have to say to you, so Hannah sent us these questions beforehand, and I was reviewing them, and I told my husband, these questions are smarter than I am. Like,
That's why I'm having you go first.
I really hope I have an answer that's smart.
You have an answer that's true. That's all that matters.
Yeah. So I love the way that you kind of tied these themes together, and I hope that my answer does your question justice. But I'll start with the easy part. So definitely the bookstore came first, as opposed to the character. Like, I love books set in bookstores. I think a lot of us do. It's just the place where books are sold and people who love books gather. And I really wanted to write a book that's like a bookstore with chaos, where so, you're not allowed to sell something, and then you start selling something. And it was a little bit inspired by this bookstore in San Francisco called The Booksmith that would have these monthly what they called like literary erotic fan fiction events, where every month they would just pick a different book and then have 6 writers write like a charged scene about the characters from that book, and then everyone would get together and those scenes would be read aloud, and there would be like snacks and booze and laughs, and it was just a lot of fun, and it just kind of taught me like the power of community that bookstores have. And Maggie was my own, not my own, but its own journey, because I was like, well, obviously I need to have a character. And so I thought it would be fun to have a character who doesn't like reading at the start. And so Maggie, like all these people are making literary references, and Maggie's like, who's Miss Havisham? Oh, is that a friend of yours? And oh, Pemberley, did you go there? Is that a university? And I just thought it'd be fun to watch like an adult fall in love with reading, because I didn't have that experience. I always grew up loving reading, and so that's how that came to be. I hope I answered your question.
Love it.
Okay.
Love it.
Yeah, I admit I was a little stumped by that question too. So that's why I wanted Shuana to go first. But
A very good question. We just don't have the smarts.
Just
Right,
listen.
right.
It's all in the books, guys. It's all in the
Right.
books.
Right. But I think as for the reinvention, in some ways, maybe it's more specific to my job and the role I've always had at the store, which is events. It's like something completely new every day. It's like the whole slate has been wiped clean, and there's just a whole new influx of books and of authors and customers and a whole new set of crazy problems that you just never
Every day.
would have anticipated could happen. But yeah, but it's just got so much more to do with community. It's such a fun and harrowing place to work at the same time, but it really is like being on a college campus or something. Just everyone you know is coming in every day, and yeah, I think it was more inspired by the bookstore and really by the vacuum cleaner. The characters were more kind of a vehicle to tell the stories that I wanted to tell. So.
Yep.
I am so curious about this vacuum cleaner. Like, I haven't read your book yet, but I have very high hopes.
I think now is the time to pivot to the vacuum. So there are like very repetitive trials that like each job has, right? Like each job has the thing that is like, oh my gosh, this again. Like we're gonna have to do this again. Like whether it's your email server crashes every day, or your vacuum does not work, or every time a certain person walks in the store, you know that they're watching you, waiting for you to make a mistake, and you're like, why? So I was kind of wondering, like, what is there's like a challenge, kind of a repetitive challenge in each of your books. I wonder if you kind of talked about like the how that helps with writing for plotting, right? So you're like plotting this thing out, and you're like, I'm going to use this thing, this tension in the book every time, Yeah.
Well, for me, I use this device, if you've read the book, called the End of Day Report, which is a real report that the store managers would send out at the end of every day, summarizing what happened that day. Everything from, this book was mentioned on NPR and all the customers want the book, to, a dog had an accident in the travel section, to,
These are not at all based on end-of-day reports that have actually happened.
This
Never.
is not fiction, this part. But, I promised the owners of the bookstore that I was not going to write a novel set in a bookstore, because I had no intention of doing that. But when I took a leave of absence, I was still on this end-of-day report distribution list. And I noticed the frequency with which the vacuum cleaner was broken, and it always came like amended with these notes like, well, it is working, you just have to kick it a few times, or so that was kind of the origin of the book. But I also really just wanted to capture the realities of working in a bookstore, because everybody thinks, somebody that I know came in once and saw me working there, and she said, that's so cute. And I thought, no, this is not cute. This is like a very stressful job. So I wanted to capture the realities of what it's like to work in a bookstore. Yeah.
And meanwhile, I'm a fraud. I have not ever worked in a bookstore. So I just did like a lot of research and poking around. And no bookseller yet has said to me, like, this book is inaccurate and you clearly know nothing about bookstores. So hopefully some aspects are right. But I can speak to having worked in the publishing industry before this, not like the interesting side of publishing, but this was like publishing professional development materials for professors and student affairs professionals, which if you're a professor or student affair professional, I'm sure what you do is very interesting, but to me, like a 23-year-old who like was hoping to get into fiction, like it wasn't all that interesting. And so I really love taking a job or a setting that can seem really glamorous and just kind of ruining it for everyone.
I honestly, I loved that.
And so with this book, I kind of like, with all my bookstore research, I was like, okay, I think of bookstores as this magical place. Like, now let's ruin it.
I mean, I think self-discovery and coming of age, I mean, like literally, like aspects of your book could be sections in a bookstore, right? Like it's like, you know, workplace education, self-improvement, advancement, locking yourself upstairs inside of a store. You know, how to win friends and influence people is absolutely a book that I feel like Maggie accidentally ends up using a lot of tips from. But I think it's like both of your books touch on the good and the bad and very ugly of how outside forces can influencing bookselling, publishing, hand selling, from people being held accountable, the court of public opinion, traditions being challenged, trying to decide what direction to move your business in, right? You say, I'm going to move the business in this way because I think that's where it is. And then people who have loved the business for a long time are so mad, even if they end up loving it in the end. We're in an industry, actually, like bookselling is very much so in flux. Publishing is very much so in flux. This is a really interesting time. I choose to see it as a time for great change and to further it so that we always have books and we always have bookstores. But there are days, right? Like there are days. How did you choose, you know, it's good, it's not easy. Like how did you choose where to focus, like the tension? Like where did the historical society that wants to control what this person shelves in their bookstore come from for you?
So it started with me just really wanting to have like a really wacky element. And so initially this author who the town is obsessed with was the town founder. And I had this whole backstory that he had like given people, he was like really wealthy and he had founded the town and given people loans to start their business with. But if they wanted the loan, they had to like ascribe by his like silly rules that were just based on his preferences. And so initially the bookstore was based on all these rules, like, oh, we can't sell novels by authors with pen names because that promotes lying and he hates lying. and just really weird stuff like that. But then when I turned in this draft to my editor, she was like, okay, but what if we wrote a book that made a little bit more sense, though? And I was like, okay. And so she had the idea that what if it's an author instead, and what if the rules were basically that the bookstore can only sell like these literary classics that were around during his time, and no like genre fiction, so no romance, no sci-fi, no fantasy, things like that. And then that kind of paved the way for just a really interesting like conversation about like what is considered a classic and why do some like snooty book types look down on anything that isn't a classic. I used to be one of those snooty book types, and I'm now reformed. And so I just think with bookstores there's just a lot of interesting tensions and opportunities for discussion and kind of around like what is a good book, and how come if we just say we like a book and people may still judge us for liking certain books. And so it's definitely about like some people certainly open their minds throughout the course of the book, and also just kind of stop caring what other people say. And so that was fun to explore, and a little bit paralleled my own reading journey in a way too.
Yeah, I was curious if you had also gone through that transition, because there's a lot of like the implicit bias of the book industry becomes explicit in this town, which is like part of the fun, where they're like, oh my God, no, it can't, it's after 1850, absolutely not, you know, and but then like, okay, well, what does that mean? Like, who gets to read then, and who gets to see themselves in books? Like, it's very limited. But I also was thinking about, you know, if it's your own journey, then you know, what did you kind of like grow up reading versus like, you know, I think a lot of people found like a genre that spoke to them during the pandemic, where we all just needed to be like comforted and find some joy, right? So whether that was romance, whether that was reading fantasy for the first time since you were a kid, you know, or something like that. I was kind of wondering if you would talk about where your reading journey is.
Yes, okay, I can break this up into 3 phases. So first, as a kid, I was reading, kids literature, middle grade, young adult. I loved it. And then I got older and was an adult, and I was like, oh, I guess I now have to read adult books because adults can't read young adult now, I guess. And then I was also majoring in English, and so then I was reading all the classic literature, and, Jane Austen and Charles Dickens and Arthur Conan Doyle. And kind of like enjoying it, but also kind of like looking over at like the fun genres and the young adult, being like, sure, it'd be cool to read you, but no, I'm a serious English major. And then I think, I don't know, around my mid-20s, that was when I kind of was like, wait, I can read whatever I want. And so then that was when I actually like read romance for the first time, because I really hadn't before, and then started exploring other genres too. And I've also realized, like, if I track, because I have a book spreadsheet now where I track all sorts of things or graphs.
You got to share that spreadsheet. I love a spreadsheet.
But it's interesting because if I track, like, the types of books I was reading, like, I don't know, 10 years ago versus the types of books I'm reading now in terms of both genre and diversity. Like, when I was just reading the literary classics, there was no diversity because it was all books by, like, old dead white men. And now that I've started reading more contemporary and more modern literature, it's, like, so much more diversity. And it was just kind of like for the first time realizing, wait, even as a kid when I was reading young adult, I didn't read many, if any, books by, like, or about black kids. And so it's amazing to go back now as an adult and just kind of see myself in all this literature.
Yeah, I love that. I always, whenever I read like a kid's book where like someone looks like us in it, I'm like, oh my god, I'm healing my inner child.
Yes.
That's why I'm reading the middle grade novel. That's why. That's totally why. I do think both of your books have what I call in my like fantasy bookstore. I own a bookstore and I don't do this. So just reality versus fantasy. It's a tension in life, guys. But would be like there are no sections, because if you were to ask me, I'm like, this book belongs in 12 sections, but you have one room. You can't put something in 12 different places, right? But both of your books defy genre category very easily, right? Like there's kind of the first category is fiction, and then you're like, okay, well wait, maybe your book is, there's some serious trials happening. There's like, people are having some problems, but it's also hilarious. And your book, they've given it the rom-com cover, but it's not really a romance, right? And so I was curious about how, when book publishing gets a hold of your book at that part in the process, right? And it's like, okay, well, how are we going to get people to pick it up? Right? How are we going to get people to read it? Versus like, does that enter into your writing process? Are you how are you able to block that out or not block that out? I mean, the genre trouble.
Yeah. I mean, when I first went to work at the bookstore, the genre title on the main new fiction shelf drove me crazy. I lobbied to get rid of it, but it's still there. Because it is troubling the way you need to put your book in a certain box, but it's how publishing works, so I understand that. As for the cover, I thought I'd written this very dark comedy, and it came out with this like very cheerful, happy
it's
cover.
yellow.
And I've seen some readers complain online, like, wait, this is about Charlottesville is in this book, but at the same time, I mean, my publisher has been great, and they are very marketing savvy, and they've done an amazing job with this book, so I kind of trust them to, it doesn't, I've tried over the years to push back on a few different covers, and I've said, this looks like a cover only a woman would read, and they're like, only women buy fiction anyway, so we don't really care. So I've just learned you can only push back so much, because if they aren't behind the cover and then the book doesn't do well, it's your fault for not liking the cover. So try to go with the flow a little.
Oof.
Yeah.
The truth.
The truth.
Yeah.
And like coming from publishing where I'm on the other side and I'm sending an author their cover, and like the context that I'm not putting in the email is very much like, you will like this cover because we know more than you and we have picked it. And so for like my first novel, I was like, okay, I have to be like the perfect author. I have to accept this. And so my first novel was a little bit darker in tone, and it similarly to yours, it was given the bright, colorful cover treatment, and there were
Yeah,
readers
your first
who,
book really deals very well with like depression and burnout really
Yeah.
well, and like there's happy moments too. But I was like, this is somebody's going to be confused on the
Yes,
internet.
there
Like, so,
people
yeah.
were confused, and
Yeah.
I was tagged in those comments, and so readers, would post about feeling a little like, okay, well, I thought it was this, but okay, it's this other thing, I guess. And so happily, my second book is like more lighthearted in tone, so that the cover matches. Like it still gets categorized as romance, but like there's like a romantic thread in there, so there's a little something. But for my third book, I was just kind of like, I don't think I want to write like a romantic arc at all if my publisher is just gonna like take any little shred of romance and then call it a rom-com, and then we just have readers who feel disappointed and hoodwinked again. And so I guess I'm in my like rebellious phase where I'm sort of trying to control what like the expectations are, what the cover will be by changing up what I'm writing about and not having like that romance arc at all. But I may go back to it down the line, but yeah, I'm a rebel right now.
I love it. Defy those genres. Defy them. So there is something that I felt in both of your books that had to do a lot with like the roles that people get put into when they're in customer service jobs, and there's a lot of like preconceived notions about who fulfills those jobs and what their backgrounds are. And then a lot of that also, if you are like present female, there's also a lot of expectations in that in life. Obviously walking through the world as a female presenting person is exhausting. And then, you get the customer service thing. And I thought it was very interesting that we have really fascinating supporting and main female characters in your book who are in positions of customer service. And it got me thinking about how those are kind of like related things, where there's some smile in bearing it, and then there's when do you push back, when do you get rebellious, when do you assert, no, this is what we're doing with my store, my space, and kind of how learning to pick and choose those battles. Because Maggie is new to this, and she's learning like, okay, I'm gonna lead an underground book club. I'm gonna kind of be a little sneaky here before we come out, and that presents certain challenges, and that's certainly one way to take negative feedback. And then, we have Clem, who's kind of already burnt out in this industry, is, a beleaguered events coordinator, which I thought was a very funny description. And then someone who's been doing it for decades and is, feels exhausted in a different way. And I was wondering, this is a very long way of saying, when you have a character who must, like, put on a smile and bear it, like, how do you get that out in the book where it's, like, internal what they're doing versus external what they're doing? Because I think there's certain actions that they take that really, really manifest this, whether it's starting an underground book club or locking yourself in a closet behind a bookshelf.
Yeah, well, for my character Clemmy, who's the younger one who's booking the events, her kind of rebellious streak is that she wants to bring this poet to speak at the store, even though her boss, who used to be a renegade and someone who wanted to take stands, is become afraid of the world and just wants to hide. So that's kind of her way of asserting herself. But what Hannah says is true. We actually started at Politics and Prose on the same day.
Same day.
We were like trained together, and in a bookstore, I think you do at least have a kind of kinder, gentler customer base. But it's true. Every once in a while, you're like, if somebody's book didn't arrive in time or it got lost or something, it is kind of astonishing the way.
We have a lot of emotions around books. There's a lot of emotions around books.
Yes. I remember you posting on Twitter, like, there is no such thing as a book emergency.
I say that like once a week, and people look at me like I'm insane. I'm like, you don't understand.
Yeah, right. No lives
This is a
are
mantra.
right. So that's Clemmy's way of trying to kind of have some control in standing up for what she wants to book, and also, to some extent the bookstore owner, because you can't really hide from the controversy. Even if you think you're hiding from controversy, you can have an event. I made this one up, but actually I didn't entirely. Like a book even about flower arranging can become controversial because of the carbon footprint of cutting flowers. So you can't predict where it's going to come from, and to just, even now in the job, it still happens. It's like, who would have thought protesters were going to show up at this very benign event? So to just kind of have a spine and keep going. If I've in any way answered your question, I don't
love
know that
it.
I have.
So coming for me, I was coming from a position when I started writing my first book as an editorial assistant and in my 20s, and so I was used to kind of not being in a position of power, and that definitely translated into the characters I wrote for my first book and my second book. But it's kind of changed depending on like the character. So for my first book, the character was a lot like snarkier, and so if she was like in customer service mode at a conference selling books, doing something she didn't want to do, she would be perfectly pleasant to other people, but then we would get her internal monologue of just like, oh my god, I hate this, I'm so tired, I want to go to sleep. But for Maggie in the banned bookshop of Maggie Banks, she is a lot like more cheerful, and so more amused by everything. And so she's in this bookstore and she's like reciting this spiel about Edward Bell, this great author who she doesn't care about, and she just thinking like, how can I make this fun, like how can I make this silly? And so she starts like talking in his voice or just thinking about like making jokes to herself and making jokes about him. I mean, I would love to have Maggie's attitude when I'm doing something I don't want to do. But yeah, I think that's how my characters kind of maintain their own sense of self while dealing with this customer servicey, not being in a position of power thing that they don't really want to do.
Yeah. All right. So we've talked about the vacuum cleaner, but we haven't talked about Kurt Vonnegut Jr., the tortoise. You're one of my favorite books of yours has a deranged bunny that may or may not be there, Susan. And then this has Kurt Vonnegut. Are you just running around endangering animals? Like, what's the deal? That Kurt Vonnegut Jr.'s The Tortoise's arc in your book, I think has a lot to do with like the stress decisions we make and where we put our reading this in the pandemic while my small dog, who I put all of my emotional baggage onto, looked at me, was I felt some guilt. Yeah.
Well, yes, I do seem to have a lot of animals, not intentionally, but I guess it's a theme because it will reappear in the forthcoming book as well.
Exciting.
But the tortoise was inspired by my stepdaughter when we moved her into her dorm at Bard. Her roommate had a tortoise named David Foster Wallace. And so until the very last edit on this book, that was the tortoise. But then I have a kind of very dark suicide theme going on with the canceled poet's wife. And then I thought, this is really, really too dark.
A little too close.
So
Yeah.
I changed it to Kurt Vonnegut
Yeah.
Jr.
Yeah.
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 Wait, can I ask, what's the book with the deranged bunny?
It's called The Stager, and I think Hannah's being a little unfair. He's not deranged. He is
Maybe the person, the receiver of the bunny is more deranged than the bunny.
Right. He might have been a little loopy. And
It's a bunny!
That one just came out of nowhere. It was one of those experiences where I was like, how do I land this plane, trying to write the end of the book, and all of a sudden the bunny just started speaking. I was like, I don't really believe in I'm not a very mystical person, but the bunny just became a character with a speaking part, and he had a lot of wise things to say. So.
I love it.
We could listen to the bunny. We could all do better listening to the bunny. So both of you have mentioned, working on a next book. So I'm just curious about, your book is coming out, your book's out in the world, and you have to do these events that, as someone who hosts author events, I'm always like, I feel somewhat terrible for authors because these are people who like lock themselves in a room and talk to the voices inside their head, and it is a kind of solo endeavor, and it's a really exhausting magical thing that y'all do, and then we're like, come talk to crowds of people for days in a row. So where do your writing reserves get filled up so you can promote one book and then write your next book? So what are your writing reserves? What replenishes your writing reserves?
Hiding. Just hiding from the world.
More hiding.
Yes.
Increase the hiding.
Yes. So I just hide away as much as I can, like just in my living room on the couch with my laptop. And then when I have to like get out and go into promo mode, I like panic about it for ages. And then I do it, and then I treat myself with like ice cream when it's over. And
Yeah.
then I go back into hiding.
There's definitely, I've seen people with ice cream cones around here, and I'm like, I'm coming for
Yeah.
you.
But I found, like, I went on like a small tour that my publisher set up in the fall, and that actually kind of helped with the stress of it, because like I was super anxious for the first one, but then I was like, well, you got to do like 6 more over the course of this week, and so then just doing it over and over again just kind of like made it less stressful for me. So I'm proud to say I didn't panic as much with this one. Thank you. But yeah, writing for me is like very much solitary.
Yeah.
Unlike my husband, who loves to do a thing where he'll open a Google Doc and then he'll like invite people to hang out in the Google Doc with him. I'm like, I don't want to be in a document with somebody else. But
He's
yes,
a lunatic.
yeah, solitary, hiding. That's my way.
Love it.
Yeah, I need some of that to get anything done, so I try to just carve out my mornings until early afternoon to write. And, you know, as for the kind of speaking and the stress of that part, I think, again, counterintuitively, working in a bookstore has taken, reduced that, because I see just the sheer volume of books that arrive, that get returned, the number of authors that come into the store, and it makes me understand, like, this is not that important. It's important to me, but like the world isn't like
No book
waiting
emergency.
for
No
the,
book
right,
emergency.
There's no book emergency. There's no event emergency.
Yep.
So
Yep.
yeah.
All right, we're gonna transition into audience questions soon, so get those beautiful minds percolating. But we're gonna enter my lightning round. These are questions I like to ask, mostly to take the pressure off you of having to think of not long answers. This is definitely not being recorded. You don't need to worry about that.
I think it is, Anna.
It's fine. Okay, so what was your favorite book as a kid, if you remember? We can pick any stage
yeah.
of kid life, too.
Yeah, I loved the Narnia books, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I'd say.
I'm gonna say Just as Long as We're Together by Judy Blume really spoke to me as like a 10-year-old. I've read it so many times.
So that's why someone locks themselves in a wardrobe.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. The last book you gave as a gift.
Okay, so We Deserve Monuments by Jazz Hammonds.
Such a good book.
Sorry?
Such a good book.
Yes, it is like young adult, and it's about someone who moves to like a small southern town and tries to like reconnect with her family, and falls in love for the first time, and it's a lovely book, and I like know the author, so I'm very biased, but I was there for a signing, and I already had a copy of her book, and so I bought another one, and I gave it to my niece.
Love it.
My answer is not quite like what you're looking for, but my mom, who's here, she's in a lot of book clubs, and she sometimes hesitates to buy the books, so I always insist, like, you must have this book. So
I love
give
that.
her a lot of books, and the last one I bought for her was the Florence Adler Swims, which
Oh,
I
Swims.
haven't read, but I will borrow it back after after she reads it. So,
All right, book you haven't read, but you keep meaning to.
like the whole canon of Russian literature, I would say. I'm married to someone from Moscow, and I'm embarrassed that I haven't read much Chekhov, so I would say that's next on my list.
'Cause I have books that like I look at on my shelf every day, and I swear they're mocking me. They're like, "Okay, you still haven't read us? That's cute."
Oh God, there's so many. There's so many books that I've bought and that I haven't read. Okay.
I'm judged by this question too. I just want you to know.
Okay. I will go with this book because it's in my head right now because it's on my coffee table and has been for like 3 months. The Final Girls Survival Club.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Survival, something like that. I bought it because I was in a reading slump and I was like, ooh, this is like a fun thriller. I want to buy it, and I don't know. Then I just abandoned it.
All right. Well, my last question before we turn it over to Q&A is, what are Shuana and Maggie doing right now? I mean, sorry, not Shuana. I made you your character. What are Sophie and Maggie doing right now?
I believe so. Maggie, she was only supposed to be in Belle River, Maryland for like a few months, and she's supposed to go back to California. But I think she ends up staying in Belle River and just making like a home for herself and doing like all the like event things that she loves doing at the bookstore, and probably annoying a lot of literary snobs still in the process with her incessant questions and jokes. And yeah, having a good time in Maryland.
I love that.
And I think Sophie has kind of gotten over her fears. I would hope she still owns the bookstore. She did not sell out. They were going to turn it into a Nike, no, a Cheesecake Factory.
Cheesecake
I can't
Factory,
remember
yeah.
which I decided on, Cheesecake Factory. She did not sell it, but she has relinquished control. She was kind of a control freak, so she's letting others do more management. And she, even though it wasn't really a romance, she met a lovely age-appropriate man, and I believe that they are still happily together.
So boot up. That is awesome. I'm glad to know that our fantasies for these characters align. My alternate universe I've made for them is approved by the authors, y'all. We did it. We did it. All right. So we have a little bit of time for audience questions. I think you just shoot your hand up. Oh, I love it. All right. Black tank top.
So I am definitely one of those people that always reaches for the book on the shelf. That's like the bookshop at the corner of,
Yeah.
the library of, or whatever. And I liked it so much I wrote, but it's coming out in March next year.
Yay!
Oh.
But I think that you have spoken wonderfully about like the experience of being a bookseller in those situations. I think why I reach for those books is I want to see myself as the reader, in those books. And like in my book, we have the moment where the older woman was like, "I'm never gonna read all the books," and she was like genuinely moved to tears by this. So I was wondering, where would the readers see themselves in your bookshop books?
Oh, the question was, where would the reader see themselves in your bookshop books?
Yeah, I think I hope that they see themselves there. They are in there as customers who, come in loving books and just having heard, they're very intelligent readers and, listening to the radio and reading the papers and coming in for those books that they've just learned about and coming to the events. And I think it's an embrace of customers in this book. I don't think there's not really too many. They're kind of, the more I think about it, because that's a good question. Yeah, they're kind of fixtures of the bookstore. I kind of open it up with a panoramic scene of, the woman who always sits at this table researching whatever she's researching, and the customer who comes in every day and goes to the travel section, but he never travels. And so, it's very much a book about community of book lovers in that book.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I think I have the same answer, that community, because Maggie, when she's creating these underground events, the community starts to get bigger with each one. And so the first one is just a few people who show up, but then, the next week Maggie is surprised to see more people are coming to this bookstore that no one ever goes to. Oh my goodness. And it's because these readers have been here, and then they are starting to really love the environment. And so then more and more people keep showing up for these events. And so it's definitely, as Susan said, the community of people who just, the regulars, the repeat customers, who the bookseller knows by name. I think that's where the readers would see themselves.
Nice. Awesome. Yes.
Susan, all of you have bookstores. I was in lockdown the day of the comic, shooting, and I thought that was the greatest day to be locked into a bookstore. And I was sort of hoping that we wouldn't get out all night, What could be better? But is that a plot line that is in your head ever, or is it? I haven't read your book yet.
Yeah,
Being
the
locked in a
question
bookstore.
has to do with the Comet ping pong shooting, and that's just on the same block as the bookstore where I work. And that presented a kind of tricky plot point for me, because I didn't really want to bring any grief on this bookstore, and I was very nervous writing. That's part of why it's unnamed. I just didn't want to bring any extra. A lot of the awfulness of that moment trickled in on. I wasn't working there at the time. I was on my long leave of absence. But, they were getting a lot of nasty phone calls, and a lot of that was spilling over. So I was very conscious of not including Comet, not including anything that close to reality. But, of course, Charlottesville is is in there. So it was a tricky plot point.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
in the abstract.
Just get locked
Exactly.
in the bookstore
Yeah.
for reasons.
Yeah, like, because my first thought when you said that was like one of my favorite kids' books, from the Mixed Up Files, of
Yes.
Mrs. Basil E.
Mhm.
Frankler, where
Yeah.
they're like in the aquarium.
The
Museum?
Metropole
Yeah.
Museum
Yes,
of
museum.
Art. I
It's
love
the
that
art.
book.
Yeah.
I should have said that. That is one of my favorites.
And so that, like, I remember that concept being really exciting to me as a kid. And so the concept of being like in a bookstore, like overnight, that sounds fun. If there's a fun context around it.
Right.
Time for probably one more question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Susan. I got invited to this book festival by my friend Jean here, and when I looked at the list of authors, the only one I recognized was you.
Oh, thank you.
So I was like, I gotta go.
Oh, thank you.
Ah.
Thank you.
I love character-driven books. I love Sophia, and I love your relationship with your son and the band and everything. It was so
Oh, thank you. That's very nice to hear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good vibes are a great place to tie it up. So please give the volunteers, everyone working this festival, and of course our amazing authors a round of applause.